The Soviet Union once seemed unstoppable. Millions of people believed the system would last forever. Space missions, massive armies, factories, military parades. The USSR looked like a superpower capable of rivaling the world's greatest powers. But behind the illusion of stability, the collapse had already begun. Corruption, shortages, fear of change, and a system that could no longer move forward. This is the story of the final decades of the Soviet Union, from Brezhnev to Gorbachev, and the fall of an empire that once controlled half the world. In 1964, Leonid Brezhnev helped remove Nikita Khrushchev from power. A new era of the Soviet Union had begun. For many people, the 1970s became a time of stability. People received apartments, jobs, and confidence in the future. The Soviet government promised that communism was getting closer. The USSR appeared powerful: space achievements, factories, military strength, and global influence. In 1961, the world witnessed the power of the Soviet Union. Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. The USSR proved it could compete with the United States not only with weapons, but also with science and technology. Under Brezhnev, massive apartment blocks continued to spread across Soviet cities as an evolution of Khrushchev-era housing projects. The government attempted to solve overcrowded communal living and provide homes for millions of people. These grey concrete buildings soon became symbols of Soviet cities and an entire generation. But behind the appearance of stability, the system slowly began to decay. The economy stagnated, corruption expanded, and shortages became part of everyday life. The Soviet Union spent enormous resources on the military, missiles, tanks, and the arms race. While store shelves remained empty and ordinary people struggled to find even the most basic goods. As the West moved forward, the Soviet system increasingly fell behind. This period would later become known as the Era of Stagnation. After Brezhnev's death, the Soviet Union entered a period of uncertainty. Yuri Andropov attempted to restore discipline and fight corruption. He understood that the system faced serious problems, but there was almost no time left for major reforms. After Andropov's death, Konstantin Chernenko came to power. The aging Soviet leadership looked exhausted, and the country increasingly resembled a system trapped in the past. The Soviet Union desperately needed change. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the new leader of the Soviet Union, the youngest Soviet leader in decades. He inherited a country in deep crisis. Economic problems, shortages, the war in Afghanistan, and growing distrust toward the system. Shops began running out of almost everything: food, clothing, household appliances, everyday products. People had money, but often had nothing to buy. Endless lines for sausage, sugar, or even a new tea set became symbols of the late Soviet Union. Gorbachev launched Perestroika and Glasnost. For the first time in decades, people openly discussed the country's problems. But the system built on decades of fear and control was already losing stability. Another major problem for the Soviet Union was the war in Afghanistan. A conflict that dragged on for almost 10 years, thousands of dead soldiers, enormous expenses, and a society growing tired of war. For many people, Afghanistan became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a symbol that the system was losing control. In 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster shocked the world. The catastrophe became a symbol of Soviet secrecy and lies. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was rapidly losing control over its republics. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, were among the first to openly demand independence. Mass protests filled the streets as people demanded freedom from Moscow. In 1991, the Soviet system began collapsing before the eyes of the world. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus signed the Belavesia Accords. The Soviet Union was officially dissolved. And later that month, Mikhail Gorbachev addressed the nation on television and officially announced the end of the USSR. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin. An empire had come to an end. In our view, the Soviet Union left behind one of the most controversial legacies in modern history. For some people, it was an era of stability and massive achievements. For others, it was a system of fear, repression, and control. The USSR sent humans into space, but often failed to provide ordinary people with a normal life. A system that built tanks faster than it filled store shelves with food. An empire that spent billions on weapons and control, while millions of people lived with shortages and fear. The Soviet Union gave the world science, industrialization, and space exploration. But it also left behind censorship, persecution, and millions of broken lives. The consequences of that era are still visible today, in wars, conflicts and crises that continue to shape the modern world. The history of the Soviet Union is the story of a superpower, and the human cost millions paid for its existence. Subscribe so you don't miss the next stories.